Hi, friends. Father Kerry here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one in response to a question a viewer asked me this week. Why was Jesus so terrified of dying in the Garden of Gethsemane? It's a good question, and it is a little strange, isn't it, that the Lord, the Son of God, who came to redeem all of us, would have behaved in the way that he did in contemplating his impending death, that horrible and dark night. It doesn't seem very dignified, does it? It doesn't seem as if it is the sort of thing that the Son of God should do. We have so many other examples of people, both real and literary, who have faced their death with much more equanimity and much more tranquility. Think, for existence of Socrates, the 4th century BC Athenian philosopher. When he was put to death, we are told, he faced his death with a great deal of calm and tranquility. He wasn't mourning at all. He was very stoical about the impending demise. Or think of the books of Maccabees in the Hebrew scriptures, when the brothers are executed one after another because they refuse to pay homage to the tyrant and are executed in quite horrible ways. Not only do they face their own ends with equanimity and calm, but so does their mother, who has to stand by and watch each one of them being executed. Or what about the literary figures that we often associate with brave and tranquil deaths? Think, for example, of Sidney Carton in Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. He's the guy, you may recall, who allowed himself to be guillotined in order to save another person. And as he's going up the steps of the scaffold to his death, he says, it's a far, far better thing I do than I've ever done before. Granted, he's not a real person, but it's literary examples like that that we tend to embrace as ideals. That's the way we hope we will face our own death. Why didn't the Lord do likewise? Well, there are at least three, no pun intended, garden variety reasons why Jesus was so frightened that horrible night in Gethsemane. And the first is that he was frightened of the physical suffering that he knew lay in store for him. Everyone in the ancient world knew what kind of a death crucifixion was. It was an excruciatingly painful death in which the victim slowly suffocated, the suffocation, depending upon the physical state of the person being executed, could last for hours. So Jesus surely was frightened of the physical suffering involved in crucifixion. There also must have been a great deal of psychological suffering because he recognized that his death would be a mark of shame in the eyes of the world. Only felons, only criminals, only terrorists were executed by crucifixion. Only those people who had somehow lost the respect of the Roman authorities would die in that way. And he also must have felt great psychological distress as well in the conviction that his mission had failed, that God had not restored the kingdom of David through him, and that tomorrow he would die an ignominious death. We even see a hint of that in one of the Gospels' account of some of his last words on the cross, don't we? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then thirdly, Jesus, as fully human, was just as frightened of the uncanniness, the weirdness, the inexplicability of death as you and I and every other human who has lived. Even if we go to our deaths with a certain degree of calmness and tranquility, that calmness and that tranquility has probably been hard won through years and years of trying to cope with the primordial death fear that all of us carry around with us. So Jesus surely was frightened for these three reasons in the Garden of Gethsemane, but then so have been many other people too, and they haven't sweat as if blood at the prospect of their own death. So something else must be going on. And I think that Thomas Aquinas, in his masterpiece, the Summa Theologiae, the third part, 46th question, gives us a clue as to what else might be going on. This is what he says about Jesus' suffering in the agony in the garden, as this moment is frequently called. Thomas writes, Jesus embraced the amount of pain proportionate to the magnitude of the fruit which resulted therefrom. Jesus embraced the amount of pain proportionate to the magnitude of the fruit which resulted therefrom. Now, what's going on there? What's Thomas getting at? I think that we can begin to appreciate it if we take a look at the reflections of a couple of 20th century biblical scholars. One is Raymond Brown, the Catholic biblical exegete, and the other is an Episcopalian priest by the name of Fleming Rutledge. Both of them have reflected deeply upon the biblical accounts of the Passion in the garden, and they're both struck by the same thing. Jesus prays in the garden for the cup of suffering to be taken away from him, if it be the Lord's will. He begs not to be tested, and he begs that his disciples not be tested in the same way that he is tested. And as we've already seen, he was so terrified that he sweat as if blood were pouring from his body. Well, the word that is used in all three of the gospel accounts of the agony in the garden for tested or testing is an interesting word, peirasmos. Peirasmos means testing, true, but it also can carry connotations of an apocalyptic battle, of the final battle that will decide once and for all the fate of everything that is. Think of the battle at Armageddon that will decide the fate of the world, that will somehow determine if human beings and God will triumph, or if the forces of wickedness and evil and darkness will triumph. It's a battle, this testing, akin to what Norse mythology called the Götterdämmerung, the final battle between the gods and the ice giants and serpents and wolves. Jesus recognizes that what is happening in the garden and what will continue to happen the next day is precisely this kind of apocalyptic cosmic struggle. It's not simply his own fate that is distressing him. In fact, that may be the least of his anxiety. No, what he recognizes is that he is on the front line, and he is an army of one. He is the only one who can decide the battle. He is the only one who can rescue not just humankind and humankind's relationship with God, but the entire cosmos from the forces of death and corruption and decay with which sin has permeated everything that is. It is up to him, and the burden of that realization nearly crushes him. That's what terrifies him, that which is at stake. So the suffering, to go back to Thomas, the suffering that the Lord experiences has the magnitude that it does because of the hope for fruit that it will give rise to. What is that fruit? The salvation of the cosmos, the restoration of that which was broken in Adam and Eve's fall, the redemption of all generations, past, present, and future, from the corruption, enslavement of sin. I mentioned to you earlier that we frequently call this episode the agony in the garden. It's a wonderful, wonderful expression, and it's perfectly appropriate because agon in Greek means combat. Jesus is in combat in the Passion in the garden. He is the warrior in whose hands the fate of humanity is placed, the fate of all of reality is placed. No wonder then he felt such dread, such worry, such terror at the prospect of what faced him, and wonderment as to whether or not he could actually do what it is that he knew had to be done. That's why Jesus was so terrified of death in the garden, terrified not so much for himself, but for you and me. Friends, I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. God bless you. If you enjoyed these Holy Spirit moments, I invite you to subscribe to the Holy Spirit Moments channel. God bless.